Hello, my name is Mara. Last year, my sister smashed my piano with a hammer right in front of our mother. And do you know what my mom said? She's just jealous. Like that made it okay. But this wasn't about music. This wasn't even about the piano. This was about silence. How I carried the weight of this family, paid the bills, stayed quiet, made peace, and still got erased from the will. They say every family has secrets. But what if yours made you disappear without ever raising their voice? Would you still call it family, or would you finally say something? I hadn't stepped into my mother's row house in nearly 6 months, but the scent hit me like no time had passed. Rosemary, lemon cleaner, and something faintly metallic, like old pipes under the sink. It was late afternoon, still bright enough for the windows to flood the living room with soft sunlight. The row house looked the merry, curated, quiet, held together by a forced sense of order. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here to give something back. Something I thought might mean something. The piano had arrived that morning, delivered to the back entrance so Margaret wouldn't see it. I'd spent the last 8 months teaching back piano lessons, cutting out dinners, and delaying my own rent just to afford it. A matte black upright, not extravagant, but beautiful. It was the kind of gift I would have died to receive when I was 10. Back then, no one thought I needed music. Today, I wasn't giving it to myself. It was my mother's birthday, 63. There were plastic table covers, a mediocre chocolate cake from a local grocery store, and Evelyn's best teacups stacked on the counter. The crowd was small, just close family, and 2 neighbors she liked to gossip with. I walked through the front door, holding a smile that didn't belong to me anymore. Nora, his oldest daughter, came running to hug me. Her 7-year-old arms wrapped tight around my waist, and I kissed the top of her curly hair. "Did you bring the surprise?" she whispered. I smiled for real then. "It's already here." I asked everyone to step into the living room. My hands were steady as I reached down to peel the sheet off the piano. It stood proud in the corner near the window where the sunlight caught the keys like glass. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said. I wanted the row house to have music again. Nora clapped like she was watching a Disney movie. One of the neighbors said, "How lovely." Isolde didn't say a word. She folded her arms and stood frozen near the kitchen. Evelyn walked over. She looked at the piano for what felt like an hour, her mouth twitching like she was deciding whether to smile or frown. Finally, she nodded. "It's nice," she said. "A bit big, isn't it?" That was all. I told myself not to feel disappointed. I hadn't bought it for approval. I bought it because something in me still believed beauty belonged in that row house. I didn't notice as old to leave the room. I didn't hear the creak of the hallway. What I did hear, loud and sudden, was the crack of metal against wood. I turned just in time to see the hammer descend again. It connected with the top of the piano, splintering the polished surface. People screamed. Someone dropped a glass. Nora covered her ears. Margaret swung the hammer again. I stood there frozen, not from fear, from disbelief, from the sheer audacity of it. She brought the hammer down once more, this time crushing a few keys. The noise was deafening. It was the sound of something sacred being destroyed by someone who had decided they didn't care. When she finally stopped, the room had gone silent. Nora was crying now, hiding behind one of the chairs. One of the neighbors muttered something like, "Dear God." Margaret dropped the hammer on the floor. It clanged against the tile like punctuation, and then from the corner of the room, Evelyn spoke so casually, it felt like a punch. "She's just jealous, Mara. Let it go, let it go." I couldn't move. My mind couldn't keep up. Let it go. A few guests started awkwardly picking up plates. Someone turned the music back on. Low, Evelyn walked back to her tea like nothing had happened. No one looked at me. I stood in front of a broken gift, a shattered offering, and all I could do was stare. Not a tear came. Not a word escaped me. Not yet. Inside, I was unraveling, but not in the way they expected. It wasn't rage, not yet. It wasn't sadness. It was something colder. It was the moment I realized I had spent years trying to prove something to people who had already decided I didn't matter. Nora tiptoed over. Her eyes were wide and red. "Why did Mommy do that?" she asked. I knelt slowly, forcing my face to soften. "Sometimes people break things when they're hurting," I said. even things that aren't theirs, she blinked. But it was for Grandma. I nodded once. I know, sweetheart. We both looked at the piano, now jagged, the keys mangled like teeth knocked out in a fight. It didn't look like a piano anymore. It looked like a warning. Later, when the guests had trickled out and the plastic cups were tossed into the kitchen bin, I walked back into the room. The broken piano still sat in the corner, ugly now, raw and exposed. No one had tried to move it. I placed a hand gently on the cracked lid. The wood was rough where it had split. I turned and looked at Evelyn, then at Margaret, and I smiled. Not the smile of someone trying to keep peace. Not the smile of a daughter desperate for recognition. A new smile, thin, knowing, deliberate. They didn't understand it then, but I knew something had shifted. Not them, me. This wasn't rage. It was recognition. Nora's voice came from behind me, soft as a breath, but heavier than the hammer Margaret had just dropped. Aunt Mara, did you do something wrong? I turned around slowly. She was standing in the hallway, her hands clasped in front of her little pink sweater, eyes wide and worried. The party had all but dissolved. Most of the neighbors had made hasty exits, mumbling excuses about work in the morning or traffic, though no one seemed in a rush when the cake was served. Margaret had vanished again. Evelyn was in the kitchen boiling water like nothing had happened, like her oldest daughter hadn't just destroyed the one thing her youngest had ever tried to offer with both hands. Nora inched closer, still watching me. I knelt down in front of her. "Why did Mommy break your piano?" she asked. "Did you make her mad?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to say something that made sense, but nothing did. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Finally, I said the only thing I could. "No, sweetie." I think I just reminded her of something she wanted to forget. She nodded like she understood, though I doubted she really did. Still, she walked over to the mangled piano and stared at it, head tilted. A long silence filled the room between us, broken only by the gentle whistle of the kettle from the kitchen. The party had ended long before the guests left, but now the row house felt like it had exhaled for the first time. Empty cups littered the counters, and Evelyn was humming the merry tired hymn she used to hum when I was in trouble as a child, like a soundtrack to a scolding. I watched her from the edge of the hallway, half hidden. She moved with her usual purpose, pouring hot water into her floral china, adding 2 sugars, a splash of milk. Then she carried it to the front room and sat on the couch directly across from the wreckage. She didn't say a word, just sipped her tea and stared at what used to be a piano. I didn't join her. Instead, I walked slowly back to the guest bedroom, the one she always kept neat, always with towels folded perfectly, but rarely used unless a cousin from out of state dropped in. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, the doorknob pressing into my spine like a final warning. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the sterile scent of linen spray and silence. Then, like a slow slide backward into an old bruise, a memory took hold. Marcus, his face in the doorway of my old apartment 7 years ago. He was holding a box full of books, his keys on the edge of the table, eyes full of something between pity and exhaustion. "Your family doesn't see you, Mara. And worse, you're okay with it." I'd stood there, arms crossed, unwilling to admit he was right. I hadn't said a word in defense of them or of myself. I just watched him leave, watched the door close, watched my reflection disappear in the glass. I never called him again. I sat down on the edge of the bed now and let that moment wash over me, not as regret, but as confirmation. This tonight was proof I had never left that dynamic. I had only distanced myself physically, but inside I'd been playing the merry notes over and over, hoping one day the song would change. I stood up and walked slowly back into the hallway. The lights were dimmed now. The row house felt like it was holding its breath again. I passed the staircase where we used to take Christmas photos. Margaret front and center, always smiling like she'd earned it. Me somewhere off to the side, blinking too fast. In the dining room, the photo wall hadn't changed. My sister's graduation picture centered her wedding, her with Nora, Evelyn, and Alda at the beach. I scanned the frames looking for mine. One small image, half obscured by glare and angle. Me at age 10, the corner of the frame cracked. Nora's drawings were still on the fridge, colorful, messy, loud with life. There wasn't a single piece of art from my childhood on display, not even one of those crayon stick figures that every kid brings home. Maybe they never made it to the fridge. Maybe they went straight into the trash. Back in the guest room, I shut the door again. I didn't bother with the light. I sat down on the bed and let the darkness crawl in around me. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for this row house. Just wait. The kind that lives in your bones, in your breath, in your heartbeat. I never left this row house, I whispered. I just changed the locks in my head. I lay back on the mattress, still dressed, shoes half hanging off the edge. The ceiling was the merry one I stared at as a teenager, wondering what it would be like to live a life where I didn't have to ask permission to be noticed. A soft knock came at the door. I didn't answer. Mara. It was Evelyn's voice, calm, measured, the merry voice she used when reminding me to clean up after his oldest messes. You'll stay the night, won't you? I swallowed. My voice was level, of course. There was a pause. Then her footsteps retreated down the hall, but in my mind, I already knew. This was the last time I'd ever sleep in this row house. I turned on my side and stared at the outline of the window against the opposite wall. The shadows moved slowly as the moon shifted behind clouds. I used to dream of playing piano at Carnegie Hall. The soft lights, the velvet seats, the hush before the first note. Now I just dream of not flinching when they speak. I don't know what pulled the memory loose. Maybe it was the weight of that broken piano still echoing in my chest. Or maybe it was the sound of my own breathing as I sat alone in the car, engine off, headlights casting long shadows across Evelyn's driveway. But it came back to me in pieces, like old song lyrics you don't know you remember until they fall out of your mouth. I was 11. The summer I learned what it meant to want something no one else thought you deserved. We didn't have much growing up. Margaret got the good shoes, the summer camps, the speech classes. I got what was left. Hand-me-downs and maybe next times. But that summer I'd saved every spare dollar from skipped school lunches. While Margaret bragged about theater camp and new clothes, I was hiding crumpled bills under my mattress. There was a yard sale down the road, old furniture, dusty lamps, a rusted grill, and there off to the side, a worn-down electric organ, beige plastic, cracked keys, one leg held together with duct tape. It was ugly, it was perfect. $1.50, the woman said. I didn't even haggle. I paid in 1s and 5s, handed over like treasure. I dragged it home myself, 3 blocks in the heat, sweating through a too big T-shirt. Evelyn didn't say much when she saw it, just shook her head and said, "Hope you're not bringing that into the row house." So I put it in the garage, and every day, while no one was watching, I played. I didn't know what I was doing, just notes, scattered sounds, but it was mine, a sound that belonged to me. I didn't need anyone's approval, not then. 3 weeks later, I came home from school and it was gone. Donated it to the church, Evelyn said. That thing was falling apart anyway, made too much noise. I remember standing in the doorway of the garage, staring at the empty space like someone had died there. That was the first time I learned joy was negotiable. When I opened my eyes in the present, the sky had gone a deeper shade of black. The row house behind me was dark now. I hadn't moved. My fingers were curled around the steering wheel, though I hadn't driven anywhere. The silence outside wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that pressed against your chest, daring you to speak. I finally got out of the car, stretching limbs that had gone stiff, and stepped back onto the porch. The swing creaked when I sat. I didn't cry, couldn't. There was something hollow, hour than sadness sitting in my chest now. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow over the yard. That's when I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. Just muscle memory, really, checking for something, anything. What I found instead was a bank alert. I blinked. The text came in less than an hour ago. Alert, withdrawal of $1,500 from shared account. 5:42 p.m. East. I stared at it for a long moment, my breath catching somewhere in the back of my throat. I scrolled down, the account Evelyn used for emergencies, the one I'd been depositing into monthly, labeled Mom Care. I opened the banking app, checked the recent activity. My fingers were cold, even in the summer heat. Along with the withdrawal was a transfer, $400 to Balloons Decor LC and $650 to Music Emporium. I didn't need to guess. A few minutes later, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife deeper, I got a message from my cousin Lisa. Hey, didn't know you were funding Margaret's birthday bash. That setup was wild. Did you pick the pink lights, or was that all her? Anyway, just wanted to say thanks. She looked really happy. I didn't respond. My hand lowered the phone onto my lap like it suddenly weighed 10 lb. They didn't just erase me, they made her me. I sat in that swing as the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves on the old sycamore tree at the edge of the yard. I could hear the faint chirp of a neighbor's television through an open window. I could feel the heat from the porch light warming the side of my face. Still, I didn't move. Eventually, I stood and walked back inside. The row house was still. Evelyn had gone to bed, or at least shut herself behind her bedroom door. I passed the piano, my piano still sitting like a corpse in the living room, and I walked straight to the guest room, shut the door, and opened my laptop. The screen lit my face in the dim room. My inbox blinked with a confirmation email from the piano company. Subject line, order confirmation, upright model L300, gift note included. I clicked it. There it was. Message to recipient for the woman who never got to play for herself. I stared at that line for a long time. I don't know if I meant Evelyn or if I'd always meant me. I closed the laptop. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed until the window began to gray with early light. Then I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked out to the car. I didn't go back inside. I didn't check in with Evelyn or Margaret. Didn't leave a note. I sat in the driver's seat again, phone in hand, not crying, not driving, just existing in that weird limbo between action and surrender. There's something that happens when you realize you could disappear and no one would ask where you went. I leaned my head back against the seat and stared at the ceiling. You ever sit in a car knowing you could drive away from everything and realizing you won't even be missed? That's when the message came in, a reminder that I was still useful as long as I stayed silent. The ping echoed in the silence of my car like a dropped coin in an empty well. I looked down. It was from Margaret. FYI, Mom's got a hospital bill due this week. Hope you can help. As always, I'm tight right now. No greeting, no apology, no mention of the piano. Just a cold, dry reminder of the role I was expected to keep playing. Caretaker, financial fallback, ghost with a checkbook. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. For a brief second, I considered typing something sharp, something that would burn, but I didn't. I just locked the screen and set the phone face down on the passenger seat. By late morning, I was back inside the row house. The atmosphere hadn't changed much. Evelyn was tidying up in the kitchen, her movements too casual to be anything but practiced. She didn't look up when I entered. The piano, or what was left of it, still sat there in the corner like a crime scene no one had bothered to tape off. The keys, half-bent and splintered, glinted in the sunlight like broken teeth. I walked past it slow and deliberate and sat at the dining table. I pulled out my laptop, opened it without rush, and began to move through the tabs like I was sorting through old paperwork, auto payments, linked accounts, scheduled transfers, all of it neatly lined up in rows. With a few clicks, I started dismantling them one by one. My name was on every bill, every grocery tab, even the gas for the row house. Though I hadn't lived there in over a decade, I'd let it happen piece by piece because it was easier to pay than to argue. Not anymore. I removed my card from the system, changed the password to the family utility login, and forwarded the final notices to Evelyn's email with a short note. Going forward, these are your responsibilities. Love, Mara. I sat back staring at the screen for a few seconds longer than I needed to. My chest didn't feel lighter, but it felt clear. Later that day, the row house settled into its usual late afternoon hush. I passed through the hallway to the den where Evelyn was speaking softly on the phone. She didn't hear me approach. I don't know how she expects us to stay afloat, she was saying. Zelda's been the glue, you know, always holding this row house together, always showing up. I paused in the doorway. She's strong, Evelyn continued. She might not have money, but she has heart. Mara's just different. She was always more sensitive. That word sensitive, that cursed umbrella term, they always used to explain away my distance, my silence, my need for space. I stepped into the room. The floorboard creaked. Evelyn turned, startled. Her hand covered the receiver like she'd been caught with her mouth full. I didn't wait for her to explain. I looked her square in the eye and said, "You ever wonder how glue feels when it's left to dry and crack?" She opened her mouth, but I was already walking away. In the kitchen, I stood by the counter for a moment, fingers trailing along the edge of the sink. I could hear her hang up the call in the other room. She appeared a moment later. I was just talking to, I heard everything. I said, not turning around. There was a pause. "I didn't mean it like that," she said finally. "You know how people talk." "Yeah," I said, turning now. "They talk, but what they say still matters." She folded her arms, a defensive reflex I'd seen all my life. "What do you want from me, Mara?" I looked at her, then really looked. Her face was older than I remembered, lined in places I hadn't noticed, eyes dull from years of pretending everything was fine. "I want you to stop pretending iceless messes are my fault. I want you to stop sipping tea while she destroys things." "That piano was mine," I interrupted. "Bought with my money, meant as a gift for you, and you let her tear it apart in front of your granddaughter. You're being dramatic, Marantha." That again, I almost laughed. "No," I said, voice calm, flat. "I've just stopped being quiet." She didn't answer. I took a breath, grounding myself. "The next time someone smashes what I love and you sip tea and tell me to let it go, I'll walk. And this time, I won't leave a forwarding address." Her eyes narrowed, but her voice stayed sweet. "You're still angry. You'll feel differently once you've had some rest. They don't fear your anger if they think you'll never leave." That thought, more than anything, had rooted me here, kept me compliant. The unspoken rule in our family had always been, don't cause waves. But what happens when you've spent your whole life treading water? I left her standing there in the kitchen and stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was lower now, casting long gold lines across the yard. I stood there taking it in until I heard her voice behind me. "You don't have to prove anything to us." I didn't turn around. "That's the problem." I said. I never did, but I kept trying. I stepped off the porch, walking into the slow dusk of evening. Link to next chapter. That night, I found something even colder than silence, a document that erased me on paper. 2 days passed before I stepped back into Evelyn's den. I hadn't meant to stay that long, but something about unfinished eggs, it's always haunted me more than the confrontation itself. I needed to make peace with the space before I left for good. It was late in the afternoon when I walked past her desk. A stack of opened mail sat, crooked near her prescription bottles. Beneath it, barely visible, was a manila envelope with her handwriting on it, curled script, deliberate, a little slower than it used to be. I wouldn't have opened it if it had said anything else, but when I saw the heading printed at the top, Last Will and Testament Revised, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't that I was surprised. It was the certainty of it that cut deeper than anything else. There it was in clean, impersonal language. The entire estate, row house, savings, jewelry, all of it, left to Margaret and Nora. My name wasn't scratched out. It wasn't marked to be discussed. It simply wasn't there. Not even a footnote, just erased. I held the paper in my hands longer than I should have, reading and rereading it as if a second pass might reveal a line I'd missed, some justification, some line about shared responsibility or emotional distance. But there was nothing, and in that moment, something quiet inside me settled. Not pain, not bitterness, just understanding. I folded the document back the way I found it and slid it under the pile like I had never touched it. By the time dinner hour rolled around, I was sitting on the front porch, phone in one hand, the other wrapped around a glass of water that had long since lost its chill. Evelyn was in the kitchen humming again, the merry tune she always turned to when the room got too quiet with questions she didn't want to answer. I sent one message to the family lawyer I'd worked with years ago when I helped my mother refinance her mortgage. I need to revoke co-ownership of the Richmond property. Effective immediately, paperwork initiated by me. Let's proceed quietly. No call, no explanation. If they could erase me on paper, I'd return the favor in ink. That night, I checked my email out of habit more than intention. Most of it was junk. Newsletters I never read, receipts from things I barely remembered buying. But one message stood out. Subject line, "You never needed permission." It was from Mr. Given, my high school music teacher, a name I hadn't heard in years. He had attached a letter, no preface, no intro, just one line in the body of the email. I found this while cleaning my old files. I thought it might finally belong to you. The attachment opened slowly. It was a scanned copy of a letter he had written on my behalf, dated 10 years ago, a recommendation for a music conservatory I never applied to. He had written about my discipline, my emotional nuance, my raw ability. Words like gifted, unconventional, and resilient jumped out from the screen. I never knew he had done it. I never asked for it. I never dared to believe someone saw me that way. I stared at the screen. My chest tightening in a way that wasn't pain, but something more vulnerable, like rediscovering a piece of yourself long buried under other people's narratives. Maybe I hadn't been invisible. Maybe I'd just been drowned out. Later that night, I stood in the hallway outside the bedroom I grew up in. The walls were the merry faded yellow. The photo frames hadn't changed. Isolde's wedding, Margot's degree, Margot in various stages of celebration. My high school diploma was still there, too, but shoved to the side, barely hanging straight. I took it down, turned it over in my hands, and peeled off the cracked frame. I rolled up the paper and tucked it into my bag. Nothing else was mine anymore. I didn't take the family photos. I didn't take the jewelry box my grandmother left in the back closet. I didn't even take the piano lesson books I'd once begged to keep. Only what was mine, only what I had earned without needing to ask for approval. I folded my clothes with care, not because anyone would inspect them, but because leaving an order mattered to me. I zipped the suitcase shut just after midnight. As I turned to leave, I noticed Evelyn's robe still hanging by the door. It swayed slightly, as if the air had caught it just so. For a split second, I thought about waking her, about asking her why, about demanding an answer she'd likely spin into a sermon about duty and responsibility. But I didn't. Instead, I walked down the stairs slowly, each step an exhale. The living room light had been left on. The broken piano still stood in the corner, unmoved, untouched. Its silence now was different. Not tragic, not pitiful, just honest. Before I left the row house, I pulled a cardboard box from the closet, one I'd packed the day after the party. Inside were the keys that hadn't been broken, the pedals sheared off in the last swing. A few chips of paint that had fallen like shrapnel. I sealed the box with tape, careful to press the edges down flat. There was no note, no address from me, only her name, Margot, written in block letters with a Sharpie. Before I left, I placed it by the front door. No signature required. The next morning I waited. I didn't hover over my phone. I didn't refresh the tracking page like I used to with packages I actually cared about. This time I already knew what was coming. They signed for it at 10:43 a.m. According to the email confirmation from the delivery company, the box was handed off to a V. Lorraine Evelyn Fitting. Let the woman who turned her face away from the damage receive the pieces I never asked to have shattered. I didn't leave the row house, didn't check the mailbox or open the blinds. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, waited for the silence to break. At 11:17, my phone rang. Margot's name blinked on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, a text lit up. "Margot, are you out of your mind?" A beat passed, then another. Margot sending that junk to my apartment. "What's wrong with you?" I didn't respond. Then came Evelyn's message. "Evelyn, this was unnecessary. Mara, you're being cruel." I stared at her words for a while. Then I typed slowly, deliberately. "Me, you raised me to take hits in silence." This is me speaking. I hit send and closed the thread for good. That was the first moment I felt something like air moving in my chest, not quite peace, but something close to it. I could breathe again, even if the breath came heavy. At 12:32 p.m., the final text came in. "Margot again. Margot, you're dramatic. You always were. You play piano. I play people, that's why I win. I didn't react. Not with rage, not with sorrow. I just took a screenshot. It was the truth I had known all along. But there it was, typed in black and white. The confession, the game. She finally said it. I whispered to myself. The thing I always knew but never heard. There was something freeing in it. When a person reveals their cruelty without a mask, it becomes easier to step away, easier to stop trying to be understood. I moved through the row house slowly after that, gathering the last loose threads of my past. I logged into every account I shared with them. Streaming services, grocery apps, online bill pays. One by one, I changed the passwords, logged out of the shared emails, removed my cards. They wouldn't notice at first, but they would. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is walk away while they're still talking. It took me less than an hour to sever a decade of unacknowledged tethering, and when I clicked log out for the final time, I didn't feel cold. I felt clean. By late afternoon, I drove out to the edge of Santa Rosa where my old apartment stood. I hadn't been there since I'd moved closer to work, but the building looked the merry. Stucco walls, iron railings, a rusting gate that had never locked right. The landlord had turned it over to new tenants now, but the place was empty today. The unit next to mine had a for rent sign, and the manager gave me 5 minutes to peek inside when I told her I used to live there. The carpet had changed, the walls were freshly painted, but when I stepped into that space, the air remembered me. I walked to the window, touched the corner where my desk used to be. The air still smelled of eucalyptus and printer ink. This is the last place I tried to shrink myself. I whispered, and I meant it. I had bent myself into silence in that apartment, poured my energy into being unnoticeable, agreeable, non-threatening. The kind of woman who quietly cleaned up after the storm, never questioning who kept causing the damage. I walked out without looking back. That evening, I sat on my front porch wrapped in an old cardigan, a cup of lukewarm tea resting on the armrest. I watched the street lights flicker on one by one as the sun dipped below the rooftops. For the first time in weeks, the quiet didn't feel like a trap. It felt earned. At 9:06 p.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected. Front porch camera. I opened the app. The camera feed loaded slowly, grainy at first, then sharper, and there she was, Margaret, standing at the bottom of my steps, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She wasn't holding anything, wasn't pacing, just watching. She didn't ring the bell. She didn't knock. She just stared at the door like she expected it to open on its own, like I owed her that much, but I didn't move. I didn't open the door. She stood there for a full minute before turning away. The camera caught the shift in her expression, something like disbelief, like the rules had changed and no one had bothered to inform her. The rules had changed and I'd rewritten them. Alone in my own row house, in my own silence. When I finally opened the door, when I finally opened the front door that morning, the air felt off. Not exactly cold, not yet, but thinner somehow, like a room that had just been emptied, like a breath held just before a storm lets loose. I stood there a moment, barefoot on the welcome mat, sensing a change that had already begun without my permission. The street outside was still, the sky muted in pale shades of gray-blue. No sound but the soft chirp of a bird too stubborn to leave for winter. The world hadn't broken open yet, but something told me it had cracked during the night. Margaret was gone. She hadn't said goodbye. She rarely did. Her car was no longer in the driveway, her coffee cup gone from the counter. She had left before the sun fully rose and before I had a chance to look her in the eye again. But my phone, it told a very different story. Still in pajamas, the row house quiet as breath, the kettle not yet hissing, I stared at the lock screen. 32 missed messages, 4 voicemails, 2 emails marked urgent, and 1 single notification that made my stomach drop like a stone in a well. The group chat, the one Evelyn insisted on keeping alive, even when everything in it had long since rotted. Lorraine family extended branches. I clicked it, and there it was front and center, already seen by everyone and their mother. A video, my video, the footage from the porch camera uploaded in silence the night before. No comment, no warning, just raw, undeniable proof. It played automatically, Margit in full frame, hammer in hand, one swing, then another, the cracking of wood and wire, brittle as bones. My piano, the one passed down from my grandmother, splintered beneath the violence. The last note it ever played was the sound of its own undoing. And me, I was there, too, motionless in the background, watching. Evelyn sat on the couch behind her, stirring tea like nothing was happening, like nothing had ever happened, like destruction was a type of ritual best ignored. Beneath the video, I had typed only this: for the record, that piano was mine, and so was the silence you demanded. By mid-morning, the clip had done its rounds. It had been shared, saved, commented on, dissected, and passed around like a scandalous secret in a church newsletter. Emojis trickled in from distant cousins, wide eyes, broken hearts, that cursed thinking face. Some said nothing at all, but others, the ones I hadn't heard from in years, the ones who had long since filed me under quiet, harmless, forgettable, they started surfacing. I always felt something was off. We never got your side before. This explains so much. I didn't reply, not because I couldn't, but because I no longer needed to. They were finally watching the version of the story I had never said out loud. The one I had endured silently while everyone praised Margit's charm, her perfection, her sacrifices. The version that didn't need me to scream or cry or beg to be believed, just shown, and somehow that was louder. More messages came in from old classmates, from parents of piano students I used to teach, from someone I hadn't seen since junior year who wrote, "You always seemed so composed. Composed, isn't that what they always said?" I was composed, calm, the peacekeeper, the one who kept her voice low and her presence quieter until now. It was nearly noon when the comment appeared from Mrs. Halberg, my neighbor of 14 years. She hadn't texted. She didn't call, she just left a comment visible to everyone, no hesitation. I've heard her play every Sunday morning for over a decade. I've never once heard her raise her voice, not to a soul. The only thing she's ever raised is hope. That one struck a nerve. 4-0. 0 likes, then reposted and reposted again. A woman who had simply lived next door had become the unexpected witness to something none of them could deny anymore. And then it began unraveling. For Margit, the digital image she'd spent years crafting, polishing, maintaining, the doting mother, the tireless community volunteer, the ever-patient older sister, began to shatter because the internet, bless its terrible memory, doesn't just observe, it archives. People started connecting dots. Someone reposted an image from Margit's brunch the morning after she smashed my piano, smiling, mimosa in hand, like nothing had happened. Screenshots began circulating with captions like, "Protect your peace even from family. Silence isn't always grace. Sometimes it's survival." By mid-afternoon, I had abandoned all attempts at productivity. No lessons taught, no emails sent, no plants watered. I just sat watching it all unfold like a storm cloud that had finally been given permission to rain. Then at 3:06 p.m., Margit uploaded a video. She was in her car, no makeup, her eyes puffy, her lips pressed together until they trembled. She didn't speak at first. Then finally, "I know what I did looked bad, but you don't know the whole story." Her voice broke halfway through. She cited misunderstandings and family complexity. She said people were cherry, picking moments. She asked for privacy. By the next morning, the video was gone, but it was too late. The internet remembered. Evelyn didn't post. She called. I let it ring. The voicemail came through anyway. "You didn't have to humiliate her," Evelyn whispered. Her voice cracked. "You've ruined everything. Our family, it'll never be the Mary." I deleted the message halfway through as if everything hadn't already been ruined, as if I hadn't been erased, dismissed, quieted for decades. They had silenced me for years. What they couldn't tolerate was the sound of my silence being broken. What they called humiliation, I called clarity. Truth had simply gone public, and I was okay with that. By dusk, the world had shifted again. The sky turned gold, tinged with pink at the edges like a blush after a confession. I sat on the back porch, curled in the old wooden chair with chipped paint, feet tucked beneath me. My tea was cold. I watched the birds flit across the yard, darting between fences and hedges, unaware of everything that had changed. That's when the bank notification came in, a sharp vibration in my lap, a single line. Account Blee shared essentials status overdrawn. I clicked expecting another text from Evelyn, another plea, another wound disguised as reconciliation. Instead, it was a transaction, a hospital bill filed under Evelyn's name. No warning, no discussion, no request. For the first time in a long time, I felt something shift again, but not outside, inside. They were paying for their own damage. The hospital call didn't come from Evelyn or Margaret. It came from my cousin Brenda, the only one in the family who ever treated me like I had my own voice. She kept her tone neutral, but I could hear the urgency wrapped in her careful phrasing. Aunt Evelyn had an episode, she said, stress-induced. They admitted her yesterday. I thanked her for letting me know. She didn't ask if I'd be coming. I didn't ask how Evelyn was doing. Instead, I hung up the phone, set it face down on the coffee table, and stared at the ceiling. There was no guilt crawling up the back of my throat. No immediate impulse to pack a bag or hop in the car. This time, I didn't move. I didn't light a candle or pace the room. I didn't call anyone to talk it through. I just breathed. Every family has a power source. The person who keeps things stitched together even when they're fraying. The one who smooths over silences and shows up when no one else does. I was theirs, and now they were unplugged. Later that morning, I took a walk around the lake near my apartment. Ducks floated in lazy formation, and kids tossed breadcrumbs from the pier. I passed joggers, older couples, a woman pushing a stroller while talking into a headset. No one looked my way, and for once, I didn't feel invisible. I felt free. The sun cut through the trees in slanted lines, and the air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and fresh water. My lungs filled with it. No static, no waiting for a call dread, no guilt, no weight, just breathe. I sat on a bench under a cypress tree and watched a boy skip rocks across the water's surface. His mother clapped when he made it past 3 skips. Her laugh echoed lightly across the lake. There were families that didn't run on silence. I just hadn't been born into one. That afternoon, I printed the music I'd composed the week after the piano was smashed. My own piece, a mournful waltz that opened in a minor key, stayed low to the ground, and slowly climbed until the final chord struck out like it had somewhere to go. I'd named it Threshold. The audition for the composer and residence program at the Berkeley Arts Collective had been booked long before Evelyn got sick. I almost cannoned, but something in me, call it instinct, call it preservation, knew I needed to play that piece. Berkeley was 2 hours away. The drive felt shorter, maybe because I didn't play any music in the car, maybe because the silence this time belonged to me. The audition hall was modest, no grand marble pillars or velvet-lined seats, just a wooden floor, a baby grand in the center, and 5 people sitting behind a folding table. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Whenever you're ready, one of them said. I nodded, sat down, placed my fingers on the keys, and for the first time in a long time, I played something that didn't belong to anyone else's expectations. Not my mother's, not my sister's, not even the ghost of my childhood self, just mine. The notes came slow at first, hesitant like steps on ice, but then they settled. The middle section swelled, rising with quiet defiance. By the final phrase, my hands landed hard, deliberate, no flourish, just a note that held and held and held. I let the sound ring until it faded into nothing. They didn't clap right away. That's how I knew it landed. Later, as I packed my music back into its folder, one of the panelists stood and approached. That was something else, she said softly. You've lived this, haven't you? I nodded, every note. That evening, as I walked back to my car under the soft haze of street lamps, my phone buzzed. A message from an email I hadn't seen in years. Mr. Given told you the world needed your sound. I smiled before I even finished reading it. For the first time, I believed him. The next day, I drove past Evelyn's row house. I didn't go in. I didn't call ahead. I didn't stop, but I slowed enough to see the curb. There, among the trash cans and soggy newspapers, sat the remnants of the piano, warped by rain, keys stained and bent, wood swollen and cracked. No one had brought it in. No one had moved it, even in ruin. It had stayed where it fell. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just kept driving. Back at my apartment, I opened the case that held my sheet music and placed Threshold inside with care. Then I turned toward my front door, heels still damp from the rain, heart steady. That row, row, row house gave me silence, I whispered to myself. This stage gave me voice. I closed the door behind me, walked into the rest of my life alone, but not lonely. It was after a lecture at a community arts symposium in downtown Berkeley when the question came. Half curious, half cautious, the room had already thinned out. Most attendees were grabbing coffee and mingling around the food table, their conversations rising and falling like the soft hum of a distant radio. I was seated in a folding chair on a low stage, the microphone still clipped to my collar, when a woman in the second row raised her hand. She wore a gray cardigan, eyes framed by thick glasses, the kind of face that felt like it had known decades of grace and hardship. "Do you forgive them?" she asked, voice steady, not unkind. There wasn't a pause. I didn't need one. I forgave myself first, I said, meeting her gaze. That was the hardest part. The moderator nodded, but her fingers hesitated over the mic switch, as if waiting for me to elaborate. I didn't. There were some things you didn't explain in public. They introduced me that day as a late-blooming composer who found music through silence, a poetic phrase someone had written in the program. Probably Mr. Given. He sat in the front row smiling like he knew something no one else in room did, and maybe he did. After the event, I walked alone to a quiet side street cafe near the university. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting a soft orange hue across the pavement. I sat by the window, coffee untouched, and thought about what had come after it all. Evelyn had been discharged a week after her hospital stay. According to Brenda, she lived alone now, quieter than ever. The neighborhood women still came by to check in, but the hum of activity around her had dwindled. Margaret had moved 2 counties south, taken a job at a different firm, and by all accounts, scrubbed most of her online presence clean. We hadn't spoken. There was no letter, no apology, not even a cold. I was wrong left on a voicemail, and yet I hadn't returned home either. It wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't pride, it was peace. They hadn't changed, but I had Nora, though. Nora was different. About 6 months after Evelyn's incident, I received a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of construction paper, pink with glitter that had mostly rubbed off. It was a drawing, a piano, blocky and uneven. Above it, a stick figure with curly hair. Beside it, another with straight lines for arms and a dress in purple crayon. There were musical notes floating in the air like balloons. At the bottom, "To Aunt Mara, I think you play better than Mommy." I sat on the couch for a long time with that drawing in my lap, unsure whether to laugh or cry. In the end, I did a little of both. There was no return address, but it didn't need one. Some things find their way. I never went back to Richmond, never stood on that porch again, or drove past the church where Evelyn volunteered. That chapter wasn't unfinished. It was just closed with the kind of quiet that feels final. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic family reunion or terror reckoning. They became background noise, static that I could lower and eventually turn off, but the music stayed. I'd started performing more in Berkeley, small venues, recital halls, a few online streams, and at nearly every show, I played some version of the Merry Melody, the one born from that wrecked piano, those broken keys. Only now it sounded different. It had morphed into something layered, textured. There were still notes of sorrow in it, but they no longer led the piece. They lingered underneath, like roots under soil. I played it once during a summer night concert outdoors beneath hanging lights. The breeze rustled sheet music, and the audience leaned in, listening not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them. The pain was still there, but now it belonged to the music, not to me. Back home, I framed Nora's drawing and placed it on the wall above my piano. Below the frame, I added a small engraved plaque with 3 words, "Play without apology," that became my reminder, not because I needed validation anymore, but because every time I touched those keys, I wanted to remember how far I'd come. Forgiveness wasn't loud. It didn't come in declarations or ceremonies. It came slowly, in the way I no longer flinched at old voicemails, in the way I stopped checking their profiles, in the way my hands stopped shaking when I played. One night, after a long session composing for a new piece, I sat in the darkened room with only the glow of my desk lamp. I whispered to myself, Not every note will be perfect. Not every silence means peace, but this life, this stage, I earned it. I closed the piano lid gently, not as an ending, just an intermission, and then I walked into the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window to watch the quiet night unfold, not as someone waiting for the next storm, but as someone finally content to just listen to the stillness. Not every silence is peace, and not every family is home. Sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's clarity. It's choosing your own voice over generations of quiet suffering. What would you have done if it were your piano, your legacy? Let me know in the comments. And if this story spoke to something you've lived, don't forget to subscribe because more real, raw stories like this are coming your way.